The Houston Texans can take the next step and go to an AFC championship game or maybe even the Super Bowl if they make these 5 very realistic moves that will address their biggest needs and help them get to a new level in 2025. And the last 2 moves, including what they should do with their first round pick this year, are easily the most important moves for their future and this upcoming season. The Houston Texans in 2024 felt very disappointing after a surprise 2023 campaign that saw CJ Stroud blow up as a rookie and take them to the divisional round of the playoffs. And 2024 had the same result, a divisional round loss in the playoffs, but it felt way worse because the expectations were way higher. Stroud didn't perform well, and some injuries and underperformers were more storylines than they would have liked, and this team has never, in its 2-decade-plus history, gotten to an AFC championship game, so let's find a way to change that and go beyond. With that being said, the first move of the offseason to get the Texans over the hump in the AFC championship game and make a Super Bowl run is by not re-signing wide receiver Stefon Diggs. Now, I get it, not re-signing the 4-time Pro Bowl, 2-time All-Pro receiver that's on your team for a team that will need a number 2 receiver next year, likely being without Tank Dell for all of next season as well, doesn't sound like a move that helps your chances at a Super Bowl for next year, but hear me out. Stefon Diggs is 31 years old. He'll turn 32 during the 2025 season, and he's coming off the first major injury of his career, a torn ACL, and where if he was younger and maybe a bigger wide receiver, I wouldn't worry about it as much, but he's a relatively small receiver who relies on his quickness, change of direction, and getting in and out of breaks. That's all stuff that, to me, that had already begun to get slightly worse prior to the injury, so now you got to figure they'll go down even more due to the injury. Because it's not just the injury Diggs is battling with. It's the age. Receivers' numbers after the age of 30 tend to start to go downhill anyway, and it's already shown for Diggs. After a monster age 29 season with Buffalo, his age 30 season was still good, but not great, and his age 31 season with Houston, although cut short by injury, was tracking to be his worst year since he was a Viking numbers-wise. Granted, players nowadays with all the information and resources available to them are much more likely to play longer and recover from injury quicker, but I'm not sure that's a bet the Texans want to make with where their cap situation is at this year as well. According to SpotTrack, they have the 25th most cap space in the NFL. There's always ways a team can manipulate the salary cap number and help themselves out for this year, but I'm not sure a team that's in this kind of shape cap-wise wants to take on a contract like Diggs that, even if it's only for a year, is going to be around 15 to 20 million AAV range. Plus, with CJ Stroud being so young, I think surrounding him with younger and cheaper weapons is a smarter way to build for this year and for the future, which brings me to my second move that's going to get the Texans over the AFC championship game hump and potentially the Super Bowl hump in 2025. Texans are going to draft Xavier Restrepo in the second round of the NFL draft. The Houston Texans have the 57th pick in the second round. That's a late second round pick. And there's an argument to be made the University of Miami standout wide receiver Restrepo won't be there at that pick. If needed, the Texans should trade up and go get him. But if there's a possibility he's available at 27 and he ends up being there, that is a slam dunk pick for the Houston Texans. Anyone who was watching Cam Ward ball out for the U last year had to have seen his favorite target in Restrepo. Prototypical slot receiver. He's undersized at 5'9", 5'10", 200 pounds, but everything else you love. His route running is the main thing. His tempo, the subtleties getting in and out of breaks, short area quickness. He creates separation for quarterbacks out of the slot, and that is an extremely valuable weapon for today's quarterbacks. Plus the toughness, the football IQ, and the ability after the catch. The NFL Draft Buzz scouting report says his game screams Julian Edelman, and his understanding of leverage and spacing is reminiscent of Cooper Kupp in college. Those are 2 of the greatest slot receivers of all time, and Restrepo is receiving comparisons to both of them. Even if he isn't to that level, especially in year 1, the Texans are getting a hell of a player. But with a QB like Stroud, a wide receiver like Restrepo, even in year 1, could catch 100 passes. I don't think that's hyperbole or overestimating that potential connection. Restrepo with an accurate, more traditional drop-back passer like CJ Stroud, combined with Nico Collins on the outside and his ability to take the top off the defense, this is a perfect fit on all fronts and a connection that we could see be dominant for the next half decade. Speaking of slam dunks, and this is definitely something that we should see the Houston Texans do this offseason. It's the third move they need to do in their quest to get over the hump. They need to cut veteran defensive lineman Denico Autry. Unfortunately for Autry, he's an obvious cut candidate for the Houston Texans. He's 34 years old. He's making $10 million a year, and he's a free agent after next year, so you'd save $9 million on the cap with basically no penalty in releasing him. And it's not like you're releasing a baller of a player. Autry was ranked 140 out of 211 qualified edge players in 2024. He was a solid rusher, but bad against the run. And to me, See, with an edge rush duo of Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson, which is arguably the league's best rush duo, he's someone you can easily replace in free agency or the draft and find a player capable of producing even more for far less money. As far as the Texans cap situation goes, there's other guys they would love to cut and get off their money right now. Guys like Shaq Mason with a cap hit of $14.6 million and not performing up to the contract. Dalton Schultz with a cap hit of $14 million being graded in the bottom half of the league's tight ends per PFF. Even someone like Titus Howard, who was solid last year, but carries a cap hit of $23 million this year and hasn't performed up to that big of a number. So why aren't they going to cut those guys? They're all on the team through the end of the 2026 season. So if they were cut now, it's a big dead cap hit this year, and it doesn't really open up any of this year's cap at all. So they aren't in a good situation there, and Autry is really the main guy that could help free up some cap space for them this year. However, with a move like that, it leaves an even bigger void in the interior of the defensive line for the Texans. Maybe the only thing that was even average or a little subpar on the Texans last year was the interior of their D-line, and where Tim Settle and Mario Edwards were solid last year, that's an area they can certainly improve on. So that brings me to my fourth move that can get the Houston Texans over the hump and into the AFC Championship game, potentially into the Super Bowl next year. They need to sign Poona Ford and Jaron Reed to one-year deals, respectively. Now, there is a lot to smile about with the pieces on this Texans defense. In 2024, the Texans had maybe the best corner duo in the league as well, with Derek Stingley. PFF ranked him as the fifth best corner out of 116 qualified corners in football. Kamari Lassiter was a 20th best corner in football. Jalen Petrie was 18 out of 98 qualified safeties. Jimmy Ward was 15th best safety as well. Will Anderson was 9th out of 119 edge rushers, and Danielle Hunter was 12th out of 119 edge rushers. But like I mentioned earlier, the interior D linemen were middle of the pack last year for the Texans, so let's go use the money they got from cutting Autry to go get a couple of short-term but really good replacements. One with Poona Ford, who's 29 years old, played for the Chargers last year, and had the fifth best overall grade among defensive linemen last year, 216 qualified defensive linemen, and the seventh best run grade while still being a solid rusher as well. You combine Ford with Reed, who at 32 has been a really, really good player in the league for a long time. He was the 26th overall graded defensive lineman last year, finishing top 20 in pass rush grade last year in Seattle. Both of these guys can help the Texans in both the run game and the pass game and can really create some depth in that defensive line room and lead to one of the most devastating D-lines and defenses as a whole in football. After the Bengals cut Sheldon Rankins, there's been a lot of talk of Rankins' Houston reunion, but I think this plan where you had two bodies who played really good football last year is better than going back to Rankins, who was injured and performed poorly last season. And I know I'm going a little over the cap right now, and maybe Ford and Reed sign for more AAV and want more years, but right now SpotTrack has Ford's market value at $6.6 million a year and Reed's at $5.7 million a year. So I think if they each sign for 1 year, $6 million per, we're in the ballpark, and that could realistically happen for the Houston Texans. But before I get to my fifth and final move to help the Houston Texans get over the hump, if you like these type of videos, do me a huge favor and subscribe to the channel. Us as a collective here at Between the Uprights have a ton more content coming your way, especially for this offseason. We've got draft content, free agency content, predictions, hot takes, whatever you want, as long as it's related to the NFL, we got it. So if you want more of this, subscribe, and we got you. Now it's finally here, Texans fans. The final move, or should I say moves that are realistic, that can get the Houston Texans over the hump to the AFC Championship game and potentially to the Super Bowl next year, are signing Drew Dahlman in free agency to a 4-year, $50 million deal, and drafting Gray Zabel with their first-round pick at the 25th overall selection. With the cap, you can always manipulate it. Restructure contracts with Tunsil, Hunter, and Howard if needed to get the cap you need for Dahlman, but don't get it twisted. These two moves are the single most important moves for this offseason and get the Texans over the hump next year. Texans fans, I'm sure y'all were sweating bullets getting nervous I wasn't going to bring up offensive line additions, because the Texans' offensive line was one of the worst in the NFL last year, 29th ranked in the NFL. That's fourth worst according to PFF last year. And every single interior lineman that played for the Texans last year ranked in the bottom half of the league in terms of their individual positions. Notable disappointing performances last year include Juice Scruggs, who was 26th of 40 centers last year in the NFL. Shaq Mason was ranked 47 of 77 guards last year in the NFL. Kenyon Green was ranked the second worst guard in football, 76 of 77 guards in the NFL. And Blake Fisher, in his 7 starts at right tackle, was the the third worst in the NFL, 89 of 91 qualified tackles. But the most frustrating part of all of that is the amount that they have invested in those guys and the offensive line as a whole. Scruggs was a 2023 second-round pick. They gave Shaq Mason $12 million a year in free agency. Kenyon Green was the 15th overall pick in the 2022 draft, and now he's one of the worst guards in the league. Blake Fisher was a 2024 second-round pick, and they have spent the second most cap space in the league on their offensive line. 3 of the top 5 highest paid players on their roster are offensive linemen, and Laramie Tunsil, Titus Howard, and Shaq Mason. 2 of their investments, Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard, haven't been bad. Tunsil is still a great pass protector. He had an 88.6 pass block grade last year per PFF, 5th most among offensive tackles last year, but everyone else is not cutting it, and it's hurting the team so bad. So going out and getting Drew Dahlman, the center from Atlanta, who was the 4th best graded center per PFF last year and 26 years old, feels like another piece that could help turn this O-line around and be with Stroud for years to come. Maybe they don't do it because of how much money they've already spent in the offensive line in free agency, but I think it's a necessary move for them. And then drafting Gray Zabel at the 25th overall pick. He's someone I've already talked about in a similar video about the Bears. Go check that one out if you're interested. I'll put the link in the bio, but I'll talk about him again because he is a great fit for this Texans offensive line. An All-American offensive tackle out of North Dakota State. He's 6'5", 305. He's got the size, athleticism, physicality, and tenacity, toughness, and versatility as well. He played all 5 lineman spots in college, but he's going to be an interior lineman in the NFL. Zabel absolutely dominated the Senior Bowl. Many said he was the best interior offensive lineman at the Senior Bowl, and I had the Bears getting him in round 2, but I don't even think he makes it that far with how far his stock has risen so far. I think the Texans, with their desperate need for offensive line, see him there at 25, and they do not blink. With that move, the Texans offensive line looks like this next year. You got tackles, Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard. You got your guards, Shaq Mason and Gray Zabel, and you got Drew Dahlman as your center. That is a huge improvement, and I think that goes from one of the 5 worst offensive lines in football to borderline top 10 next year. And with CJ Stroud at quarterback, Nico Collins and Restrepo in that wide receiver core, Joe Mixon behind the first competent O-line of his career, and with a defense that has now a solid interior defensive line, the Texans could be poised for a playoff run that they've never had in the history of their franchise. I'm Matt from Between the Uprights, and that's going to be it for me. Peace.